Hi, this is T. Michael Coleman, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
Hey, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. What I've got for you today is another one of the excerpts from the Doc Watson special episodes, and this is the interview with T. Michael Coleman. As I explained when I did the Jack Lawrence one, the Doc episodes, they were great and a lot of fun to do, but they ended up being really long, and I know not everybody has time to listen to 5 hours of stuff, so I'm pulling out some of the key interviews and putting them out just as separate standalone things to give more people a chance to hear them. And this is just one of the most cool bits from those episodes, not only to get to have this conversation, but just in terms of the insight and understanding of Doc and his music that T. Michael has, the time he spent playing with him. I think this is just a treat to do, and yeah, I really hope if you haven't heard this you enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, do go and check out the rest of the Doc stuff, either the standalone episodes or almost 5 hours of it, because there's so much stuff in there from people who knew Doc, played with Doc, or just love Doc, and they're well worth a listen. So do and go and check those out. But here comes the conversation with T. Michael Coleman.
When I was in college, I was on a work-study program to help pay for my college, and there was a coffee house in the student union. So I would sometimes, go help out with the sound. And one of those times being when Doc and Merle were playing at the coffee house, which was 10 miles from Deep Gap. And the next time they came around, I was not scheduled to work the sound. But on that day, someone came and knocked on my dorm door and said, Doc, Merle said he wanted that hippie guy to come over and run the sound for them again. So, and what's interesting is years later, after I had played with Doc and Merle for a while, he hadn't connected those two things. And I reminded him that was me. But the way I started playing with them is I was in another band in college and after college. And we sometimes opened up for Doc and Merle, and we were very progressive. We were playing Shady Grove with conga drums and electric guitars. It was sort of like a Mumford and Sons, but back in the 70s, early 70s. Merle would hang out with us a bit because we were close in age. And when that band disbanded, pretty much within a couple of weeks, I was in the hardware store in Boone, North Carolina, and Merle followed me in, and he said, would you like to come play with me and Daddy? And of course, living in Boone near Deep Gap, they were idolized, and my answer was quicker than his sentence ended. So they wanted me to come down to the house and play a couple of songs and see if it would be a nice fit. So I went and made the mistake. Any Southern boy should know better than try to knock on the front door, because no one in the South uses their front door, because they gather things in front of the door. So Rosalie, after a bit of clattering, she opened the door and said, honey, come around the back. So I went around the back and went in, and there sat Doc Watson, and I was pretty speechless at the time. They had set up an amplifier for me. I had my bass. They decided that we would play T for Texas. We played T for Texas, and Doc said, he'll do. And that's the last time we practiced for 15 years.
Wow. That's amazing. And it's a really interesting, for a figure that is so connected with sort of traditional and roots music, the idea of having a trio with an electric bass was pretty progressive in itself at that point.
I think it was a matter of being progressive and convenient, because they knew traveling with a stand-up bass would be, bothersome. Although we weren't flying, we were traveling in a Winnebago at the time. And Merle always had his eye and his ear on what was happening. And bluegrass festivals were merging with rock and roll festivals. Mm-hmm. And the sound systems at that particular time weren't the best in the world. And Also, with me playing electric bass, they put pickups in their guitars. They weren't relying on microphones or the sound man that was sitting out front that'd been there for too many days and had too many other things influencing them. and it was basically they wanted to be heard, and Merle liked my interaction with the way they played, and those were the factors. And I don't know that being progressive was the top thing. It was many things in that recipe.
And do you remember sort of what the first shows you played with them were?
The first show I did with him was at the Exit Inn in Nashville, Tennessee. And in the audience was Waylon Jennings and a bunch of other country music stars. And there was a green kid from North Carolina. And I was pretty much awestruck. And I sat in the middle as a result of not ever rehearsing. And Doc knew so many songs that I would look back and forth to the guitar necks so I could follow along. And it made it a little difficult sometimes when they were capoed in two different positions. But that's why I sat there.
And that was it from that day on, you sat in the middle?
I sat in the middle, yes. Which is unusual because the star of the show usually sits in the middle. And there were some TV shows where they would rearrange where we were sitting, and Doc being blind, sometimes he would forget that, and he would always lean over to his right to talk to me. Yet I wasn't there, and I would talk from the other side, and it sort of, wait a minute, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, I guess just the things that you get used to on some things you take for granted on stage when you can see everybody around you. And I think it's really interesting, the sort of the sight line to be able to see their guitars, because anybody who's played in any kind of bluegrass jam knows that being able to see the guitar player's hands is really useful.
Oh, it's very useful because it's impossible to know every song. And Doc and Merle, they were really good about telegraphing where it was going. The only really difficult thing that served me well in my music career was Doc being a mountain player first, and sometimes a lover of Delta blues. He would just sometimes skip a beat. Okay, let's go to the 4 chord. Yet you hadn't counted the 4 yet. Maybe it was 3.5, but somehow he would telegraph that move, which I was able to follow in later years.
And being from a similar sort of area to them, did you sort of, I guess the repertoire of material that they played was huge, but I guess if you grew up in that area and knew a lot of that music anyway, it probably gave you a fair head start.
No.
Excellent.
I was a rock and roll guy.
Okay.
I was a Beatles fan from the day I heard them, and rock and roll, Led Zeppelin. That's what I listened to. I did grow up with an Uncle Woodrow that played banjo, and that was in the back of my head, and all that kind of music at family reunions was considered, homemade, made up music. And I was in a rock and roll band. And I was in a rock and roll band until I went to college and discovered folk music while I was in college, and discovered who Doc was in a music store. There was a display of albums, and I asked the proprietor, "Who is that?" And there I was, 10 miles from where Doc lives. He says, "That's Doc Watson. You've never heard of Doc Watson?" I said, "Did he play with Hendrix?" I don't know who he is. So he gave me an album, and I went home and listened to it, and I was shocked and amazed. And what struck me most was that I understood what they were doing rhythmically, that I could fit into that slot and not cover them up or cloud up their music. I knew I could do that, and it came to fruition later.
And that's some learning curve in terms of the repertoire then, if you came at it from a different world.
No, because rock and roll is a good prerequisite to anything, because it involves a lot of chords, a lot of rhythms. So the lucky thing for me is when I was in a band in high school, I was the guy who would buy the records and learn the songs. And that gave me an education of how music works theoretically. And that served me well into playing with Doc and Merle because I understood what goes together.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you've got a good ear, then that's half the battle. And was there anything sort of when you found yourself playing with them on stage up close, was there anything about the playing that sort of surprised you or you hadn't picked up from the records? Is there anything different about being sat in between them?
The power of three people playing in sync. It was, I have listened to recordings, within the last few years, and it was like a freight train. It was rhythmically, it was like no other band I've ever played with. It's just everyone did what they needed to do and stayed out of each other's way. But the power of that trio, I pitied any band that followed us.
It's an amazing thing when people can make acoustic music that feels, like a complete rhythm section and everything's there, and just the power of you can generate just with picks and strings and hands. When you hear the best people do it, is astonishing.
Yeah, it's like the syncopation and everything mixing together. It's not a full-blown band playing at 100%. It's playing in your lane, complementing the other players, and therefore you're creating a better auditory picture that comes at you stronger because nothing is psychoacoustically eliminating the other.
Yeah, totally. That makes a huge amount of sense. And you played with Doc for the next 10, 15 years. Was that? Did you imagine when you first arrived? Did you imagine it would go on anywhere near as long as that?
It didn't really. That didn't cross my mind. I was in such a humbled space, and that I was sitting there playing with these guys, and from place to place, realizing the respect people had for them. There'd be people coming to the concerts, and they would be in such awe of Doc. They would be nervous just to meet him.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old-time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com. Yeah, it's amazing. Just now, obviously, I've never seen Doc live, never met Doc. And from, a whole ocean away in a different continent, just the power of that music to spellbind people, and the way just carrying out the interviews for this podcast and talking to people about Doc, and the sort of the depth of feeling people have about the music, and that comes from the person.
It is. That's exactly right. It comes from the person. There was no pretense. He was who he was. He was Arthur Watson from the mountains of North Carolina. And his blindness almost gave him an advantage over everyone, because no matter where he played, he could feel as though he were playing for his relatives or for friends. And he would really get involved in the songs, especially the really emotional songs. I can't tell you how many times he would break down in tears because a lyric would hit him so hard and so meaningfully. And Doc, and his personality came across. And I think people were shocked when they met him. That guy you saw on the stage is the same guy sitting in the dressing room.
Yeah, and we've sort of, I think, as pop music has grown as an industry over the past few decades, we've reached a point where people are trying to project so much. Like, you can hear people trying to be emotional when they sing on a huge amount of pop records. And so when you hear a record from somebody who is just being themselves and just singing, whether that's Doc Watson or Hank Williams or whoever,
right.
It's just like somebody's opened the curtains and let the sun in. It's just so direct and so like unaffected. It's a beautiful thing.
It's basically the ability to open a vein and bleed. It's what you're doing. You're when he would sing songs, especially when members of his family would die and when Merle died, there's certain just lines in the song, almost, it would bring about tears, and he was visualizing in his head, his loved one. And that, songs that were written back in the mountains were written to express feelings, to communicate. And he kept doing that throughout his career. He was communicating more than entertaining.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. Because any form of art is essentially an attempt to communicate with people.
Yes.
It's taking a bit of what it's like to be you as a human and trying to connect that with other people and express it in some form.
Without trying.
Yeah. Well, and some people do try, and the trying can put you off. But and I was really curious because you obviously played with Doc again in the last couple of years.
Did.
And was anything particularly different at that point? Was it still pretty much the same sort of feeling, or did he sort of changed as a musician in any way?
Well, he was still Doc, and he was still playing well, but he was. You could tell he was getting older, and that part changed. But the reason he was still out there at that age is because he loved playing in front of an audience.
And I think you see that just watching things that were recorded fairly late on, like the Three Pickers concert, for example, there's such a power there still, and and you to see the joy other people get from the music was one of the first things. I got into Doc Watson relatively late in my life, but to see the effect the music had on other people is almost as appealing as the effect of the music itself. It's part of it's something that you can't not notice.
Absolutely. He through his expression of music and his background, when he first went to New York during what Doc and I would laugh about and call the folk scare of the 60s. When you were talking about trying too hard, you would have people on stage singing in 4-part unison, is what we used to say. And so when Doc and Bill Monroe and those guys started going up to New York, all these people would gather and they go, now there's the real thing. That's what we're trying to hear. Maria Muldaur, Bob Dylan, Jose Feliciano, whoever was in New York, they would always flock to see Doc or Bill Monroe or any of the real guys.
And it's fascinating that that whole period, just how much overly produced, overly sort of. I think Bryan Sutton described it as homogenized, but just folk music with all the edges taken off it. That was sort of put out for the pop audience.
Yeah, lounge folk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, and it's when you.
That's when the the A&R people and the music people, we need to round out the corners to appeal to more people, but they're taking away the things that I think would bring in more people. It's amazing how Doc would pull in rock and roll people and folk people. It's because they identified with it wasn't so much the genre of music, it was the stories behind the music and how he got there, and his folksiness from the stage without even trying.
And sometimes when you take the edges off something to try and sell it to a bigger crowd, you actually remove what the thing is completely. It's the edges that make it what it is sometimes.
That's absolutely true. And, young people will always come back to the edges. But, that's what happens. Look at how many people have flocked to Billy Strings, how many people have flocked to bluegrass music, and, the Mumford and Sons. They took advantage of that, but not on purpose, I don't think. But, and the Avett Brothers, they have sort of captured a whole audience that wants genuine music.
Yeah, and it seems to be something that will keep on coming around. Every few years there's a something else that puts it back in the spotlight, and people just want those sounds in their ears, and they want something that feels like it's from the heart.
There are about 3 directional signposts that did that. Will the Circle Be Unbroken album by the Dirt Band, that brought in a lot, and that's about the time that I started playing with Doc and Merle. Merle had realized these guys appeal to younger people. We need that audience. We need to get up there, and we need to have that long-haired guy sitting on stage with us. So they, number one, he can identify with them, and plus he knows how to play. Then the second would be probably, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That movie, and Alison Krauss, and that music, and everyone mistaking that George Clooney sang that song when it was Dan Kaminsky. And then now it's Billy and the Avett Brothers. They're the ones that are packing the stadiums, and he always makes a point to say, this is where I got it from. This man is where I got it from.
Yeah, I love that. He doesn't just play the songs because he loves them. He plays the songs and tells you where they came from, so you can go and find them too. It's and there's something very cool about the fact that Billy has invited you guys to do the Doc at 100 shows with him, and it sort of brings that whole thing full circle. And there's something about just keeping that music alive by playing it and loving it and putting it in front of people. So there's something lovely about the fact that he's invited you to do that show as part of his tour.
Yeah, well, Billy and I have been in touch, for a couple of years through the pandemic. I did his podcast with him, and he told me a story. He had never seen Doc before, and he and his mother and his father drove 15, 16 hours to come see us play when we were playing with David Holt near the end. And Billy said he and his family were sitting there in tears the entire time because they had never seen Doc before. And a funny aside, David Holt and I went into a hamburger place to get a hamburger before the show, and Billy said he and his family were sitting there, and he was too nervous to come up and say hello to me.
Wow. I mean, yeah, and he no way would have he imagined at that point that at this time he'd be about to share a stage with you all, sort of celebrating Doc's 100th birthday.
It's going to be very special. I think I'm touched by his loyalty, and I think he's going to be touched when we get up there and play with him the first time.
Yeah, and that night you've got Bryan Sutton and Molly Tuttle, but it's a whole series of shows you guys are doing as well. It's not just the one show with Billy. You've got a whole set of dates for that as well. And I talked to Jack Hinchelwood recently about the shows, and just the storytelling and celebration element of it, as much as the music sounds like it's going to be special.
It is. And, the trouble is there are stories you can tell and those you can't. And, you don't want to be repetitive and tell the same story every time. You want something to be new. So, as with the Doc shows, I know Jack Lawrence and we're pretty much, off the cuff. What memory springs up that we want to share about Doc?
And you get some memories shared from the audience as well, by the sound of it.
Yes, we do. I think that comes when Ted Olson does his little masterclass at the beginning. I think a lot of people share that. And I have this group called Picket Son, which is during the pandemic. My son said, "Well, why don't you start, a little group and to further the memory of Doc and Merle?" And on that, there are a lot of people that share their experiences with Doc and when they've met him. And it's quite humbling to be here in my life and being considered Doc's bass player, his musician. It's something I'm very proud of.
Yeah, and it's something that I think means a lot to a lot of people, and to be able to share those memories with you must be incredibly special to a lot of people.
I think it is. I think it is. And I love that there have been a lot of families that have named their little girl Sadie after my song.
And you have a recent record out as well, don't you, called Sitting in the Middle, which is also a sort of musical tribute.
It is. It started as a result of this Picket Son group, and I was home. I was not going anywhere during the pandemic because it was very scary. And I just sat down and started recording songs that I had played with Doc. And I thought, well, I'll just put this on a CD. And of course, my son says, "No one buys CDs anymore. What are you doing?" So I did it anyway. And it was a labor of love, to say the least. It made me realize how great his song selection was.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because people talk about the guitar playing, and people talk about the singing, and people talk about banjo playing, and people talk about all sorts. But the choice of material, I'm doing a similar episode to celebrate 40 years of Tony Rice's Church Street Blues record.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of interviewing a lot of people for that as well. And it's another one where just song selection is a big part of it. And that, Doc did all the old ballads and the fiddle tunes, but he also did some pop songs, and he also did things like Tennessee Stud, and he also did some bits of swing, and like whatever grabbed his ear was fair game. And I think
the Dockabilly record, which, boy, that was like pulling teeth to get him to do that. Well, not really. He loved that music, and he would always play those songs because he played them when he was supporting his family in a little rockabilly band. It was just hard to get him to let me call it Dockabilly. He did not want that at all. But finally, he acquiesced and let me call it that, which is a perfect name.
I mean, it's too good to let go, right?
Exactly. You got Dwayne Eddy playing on the records. You got Marty Stewart, Junior Brown. It was a lot. We did that in 2 days.
Wow.
All that pretty much all the records we ever recorded were done in 1 or 2 days. But not a lot of overdubbing. We would just count to 4 and play.
So no rehearsals for the gigs, no rehearsals for recording. Turn up, count in, off you go. No,
it's about listening. And the records that I produced, I always hired the people who knew Doc, and he would invite them on stage to play, like Jerry Douglas and Sam Bush and Stuart Duncan, and Alan O'Brien. They knew Doc, so they knew what to do, and they knew to listen. And that's 90% of playing music, is to listen. And the other half, as Yogi Berra would say.
And I think that sort of loops us back round to where we started this bit, in just the idea that Doc and Merle turned up and you weren't there sound engineering that day, and you go and get that guy. He knows what he's doing. He was, he knows how to listen, I guess. And
I guess that was the catalyst of it, that even though it was probably embedded in the back of Merle's brain that, this guy knows what to listen for, even though he didn't make the connection between musician and old hippie in the back, or young hippie in the back.
That's great. That's all really, really cool stuff. Are there any particular sort of, out of all those years, it'd be tricky, but are there any particular memories or any particular thoughts you've got that you'd like to share? Any aspects of Doc that you'd like people to think more about?
He was really uncomfortable with people idolizing him. He didn't know how to respond. For instance, And he treated no one differently. He thought he himself was no better than anyone else, and no one else was better than he. I remember at the Bottom Line in New York one time, John Denver came to the door, and it knocked on the dressing room, and I came out and it says, "Michael, can I meet Doc?" And I said, "I'll go check." So I'll go inside and say, "Doc, John Denver's out here, and he wants to say hello." And he says, "Well, tell him just to wait. I'm going to finish my hamburger." Or, we'd be playing somewhere at a concert in Los Angeles, and you look on the side of the stage, and there would be Maria Muldaur and Linda Ronstadt and Bonnie Raitt, just, coming to pay homage to Doc. Yet not brave enough to come say hello.
It's funny, isn't it? One of the interviews that I did for this, and I think it was probably with Jack Hinchelwood, saying that Doc's manager had phoned in to tell him he won a Grammy for the first time. And he sort of said, "Yeah, can you call back later? I'm in the middle of watching Love Boat."
That's true. He was nominated, and they wanted to give him a Kennedy Center honor. And he said, "I don't need that. I don't want to do that." You remember the movie Cold Mountain?
Yeah.
The director called me. He wanted to open the movie with Doc Watson sitting in a cabin playing banjo, and he was going to push out into the mountains of North Carolina. And Doc says, "Nah, I don't want to do that." It just kind of, it wasn't, he just didn't need it. He would rather sit home and, eat Rosalie's cooking.
And if you're that grounded in what matters to you and what doesn't, and you put that into your music, it's sort of no wonder that people respond to it.
He always said, his music was what he did for a living. It was not who he was. Because when he was home, he was still Doc, but he wasn't that musician Doc. Because you have to have a certain mindset to be able to go out there and play, not being affected though. But he was more Arthur than he was Doc Watson at home, because Rosalie's there going, "Arthur, go do this, or go do that."
And maybe that is a useful thing, to be able to have a slightly public version of your persona that, when he's on stage, he's Doc, and when he's at home, he isn't. Must be a help.
No, I'm sure it helped keep him grounded. And he was a pretty grounded individual. And there was nothing he would not try or do. For instance, in the Winnebago one time, one of the guys, they were driving and they ran into a walkway of a hotel and knocked a huge hole in the Winnebago. So Doc said, "Michael, I think I can fix that. Why don't you pull the Winnebago up here to the second floor landing? I'll climb over the railing on top of the Winnebago." He did that. He patched it with duct tape and then climbed back over. And that patch was on there the day we sold it 5 years later.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collinsguitars.com and find out why.